So last year, when I desperately needed a change of scenery to tackle the stubborn ending of my novel, I found what seemed like the perfect escape. After hours of scrolling through Airbnb listings that blurred into a sea of sameness, quaint cottages, rustic cabins, and the occasional yurt, I stumbled upon a listing that caught my eye. It was a large, isolated house on a secluded island near Cape Cod. Remote, peaceful, perfect for a week of uninterrupted writing. The host, a fellow named Arthur, had a solid reputation with a badge of superhost that glittered like a beacon of reliability. As I packed my bags, I envisioned myself as the cliché novelist retreating into solitude, perhaps emerging with a manuscript that would make my editor weep with joy. The journey to the island was less picturesque, involving a queasy ferry ride that suggested my stomach preferred solid ground, followed by a bumpy ride in an ancient jeep driven by a man who believed road signs were merely suggestions. Arriving at the house, the scene was straight out of a brochure for writers' retreats you can't afford. The house was perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, its walls aged by salt and storms, windows gazing out like weary eyes. It was larger than it seemed in the photos, with a demeanor that suggested it had stories to whisper if you dared listen. Arthur was waiting for me on the porch, his presence as surprising as finding a butler in a haunted house. He was an older gentleman, his hair a rebellion of white that contrasted sharply with his deep-set, serious eyes. His smile was a diplomat's, polite but holding back secrets. "Welcome," he said, extending a hand that felt like it could break walnuts. "Thanks," I replied, trying not to seem too eager to escape his vice-like handshake. He gave me a brief tour, pointing out the quirks of the house with a hint of pride. "Built by my great-grandfather, survived 3 hurricanes and 1 particularly nasty divorce," he quipped. His humor was as dry as the dust on the antique furniture. Then came the rules. As we stood in the kitchen, which smelled faintly of herbs and something less pleasant I couldn't place, Arthur handed me a sheet of paper. His demeanor shifted from quirky host to grave sentinel. "These are the rules of the house," he intoned, as if reciting an ancient law. "Follow them, all of them, no exceptions." I took the paper, half expecting to see instructions for summoning a demon, or at least how to properly separate recycling. Instead, the rules read like the setup for a horror movie. 1. No lights on past 11 p.m. 2. Never go into the basement no matter what you hear from there. 3. Ignore any knocks on the door after sunset. 4. If you see a figure in the garden, do not interact. Retreat into the house immediately. I raised an eyebrow. "Are these serious?" I asked, hoping for a chuckle to break the tension. "Very," he replied, his face unreadable. "The island has its peculiarities." As he left, his smile was more enigmatic than reassuring. "Enjoy your stay," he called over his shoulder, leaving me alone with the whispering sea and a list that suggested my stay might be more about survival than syntax. Now you might think that a set of rules like Arthur had given me was some quaint local custom, perhaps intended to give a flavor of old-world charm to an otherwise mundane vacation spot. If only. I stood in the fading light of the kitchen, rereading the rules, wondering if perhaps Arthur was part novelist himself. Because surely this was all a setup for a story I wasn't keen on starring in. 1. No lights on past 11 p.m. The idea seemed ludicrous at first blush. What was this? A summer camp for vampires? I half expected to find a follow-up rule mandating garlic at all doors and windows. Maybe Arthur thought the less I saw, the less I'd noticed the decor hadn't been updated since the Nixon administration. 2. Never go into the basement no matter what you hear from there. Now, this was getting interesting. What could possibly be in the basement? A family of raccoons conducting seances? The ghost of a disgruntled bootlegger? My imagination ran wild, but the rational part of me assumed it was probably just moldy and prone to flooding, a common trait for island homes. 3. Ignore any knocks on the door after sunset. This was the kind of rule that had me making mental notes of where the kitchen knives were stored, In the city, a knock on the door usually meant a delivery or a neighbor complaining about the noise. Here, it seemed to herald ghostly visitors or wandering spirits who hadn't caught up with modern technology like doorbells. 4. If you see a figure in the garden, do not interact. Retreat into the house immediately. Now, this was just getting ridiculous. Was this figure a leftover party guest from Gatsby's less successful Prohibition bash? Or perhaps a wayward zombie looking for directions to the nearest graveyard? The island was isolated, but surely this wasn't a normal thing for anyone. Despite my internal mockery, a small part of me, the part that loves horror movies and ghost stories, thrilled at the mystery. So, with a shrug, I decided to play along. It could be fun, right? A bit of a spooky adventure to spice up my writing retreat. The first night passed uneventfully enough. I adhered to the rules, mainly because my mother's voice in my head admonished me from thousands of miles away not to upset the host. Even in my mid-30s, I wasn't keen on invoking maternal disappointment. The house creaked and groaned as if settling in for a good night's story itself, but nothing too alarming. Then came the second night. I was deep into a particularly tricky chapter when I first heard it. A scratching sound, like fingernails on wood, coming from the direction of the forbidden basement. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, and listened. There it was again. A scritch-scratch like a Morse code message from the netherworld. Or maybe just the house's plumbing acting up, offering its own critique of my prose. Curiosity piqued, I stood up and tiptoed across the creaky floorboards towards the basement door. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, half expecting to hear whispered threats or the chains of Marley's ghost. Instead, there was a silence that seemed to pulse with anticipation. I chuckled nervously, chastising myself for getting worked up over what was probably just a rodent or the wind. Pulling myself away, I remembered Arthur's ominous tone when he laid down the law. With a roll of my eyes, I retreated, my retreat as strategic as it was reluctant. "Nice try, Arthur," I muttered under my breath. "But it's going to take more than B-movie sound effects to scare me." However, as the shadows lengthened and the wind howled like a banshee at a bad opera, I couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps I wasn't alone in finding entertainment in bending the rules of a good ghost story. By the third night, I had begun to treat the house's quirks as part of my daily routine, like avoiding stepping on sidewalk cracks or refusing to open umbrellas indoors. A little superstition for safety's sake, I told myself. But the isolation of the island was starting to get to me. My only companions, the spine-tingling drafts that seemed to whisper through the hallways, and the occasional seagull critique squawking at my plot choices. The rule about not answering the door after sunset had seemed particularly easy to follow, until that night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with strokes of crimson and purple like a bruise on the world, there came a knock. Not the timid tap of a lost traveler, but a firm, deliberate thud, 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 resonating deep into the bones of the old house. I froze, my finger poised above the save button on my laptop. The knock came again, insistent. Curiosity, that old traitor, got the better of me. Peeking through the living room curtain, I saw nothing but the creeping tendrils of the evening fog. "Must be the wind," I muttered, aware even as I said it how feeble it sounded. Back to my manuscript, I tried to refocus on my protagonist's dilemmas, which suddenly seemed trivial compared to the eerie insistence of whoever, or whatever, was playing ding-dong ditch in the middle of nowhere. The third time the knocking came, it was accompanied by a voice, soft and melodious, like the tempting call of a siren. "Please, I need help," it whispered, barely audible over the howling wind that had picked up its pace as if angered by the intrusion. This was getting ridiculous. Rule or no rule, I couldn't just ignore a possibly distressed soul out there. Grabbing a flashlight, I approached the door, armed also with the bravado that comes from too many years watching horror films and yelling at the characters for their obviously poor life choices. I swung the door open, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife through butter. Nothing. The porch was empty, the night air filled with the salty tang of sea spray and a hint of something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. I shuddered, not entirely sure whether it was from the cold or the realization that I might not be as alone as I thought. Retreating inside, I locked the door. Another broken rule, if I was keeping score, which I decidedly was not. I was beginning to understand the method to Arthur's madness. Perhaps these rules weren't meant for the protection of the house, but for its temporary inhabitant, me. As if in response to my realization, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the garden from the corner of my eye. There, just beyond the reach of the house's dim lights, was a figure. Tall and thin, it swayed slightly as if dancing to the tune of the stormy winds. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the rustling of the bushes as a souvenir of its visit. The next morning, under the harsh light of day, it was easy to laugh off the night's fears. I even ventured out into the garden, half expecting to find footprints or some other clue. Instead, there was only the disturbed earth of the flower beds, as if the wind itself had taken a stroll through them. I retreated back inside, my laughter echoing a bit too loudly in the empty house. It seemed the joke was on me, and the punchline was yet to come. I was playing a part in a story, all right, but it was starting to feel like it wasn't one I was writing. By the fourth night, my usual bravado had started to fray at the edges. Despite my best efforts to rationalize every creak and moan of the house as just another quirk of its old age, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that I was part of some macabre reality show. Ghost Hunters, Amateurs Edition, or perhaps So You Think You Can Ignore the Paranormal. The scratching from the basement had become a nightly occurrence, like a sinister lullaby coaxing me into nightmares. I began to imagine a lonely ghost down there, perhaps a failed musician, practicing for a spectral recital where the audience was eternally just out of reach. On this particular night, the wind was particularly boisterous, as if it had taken it upon itself to be the soundtrack to my growing dread. The old windows rattled in their frames, performing a ghostly percussion that no sane person could sleep through. At around midnight, I decided to confront my fears head-on, armed with nothing more than a hefty flashlight and a dose of idiotic courage, because why not? I tiptoed towards the basement door. I told myself that it was just to check that it was securely locked, because suddenly I was concerned about practical things like security in a house where the biggest threat seemed to be supernatural. But as I approached the door, the familiar scratching paused, and in its place, a low, mournful wail began. It sounded like a wind instrument out of tune, or a cat in distress, or a combination of both. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob, my heart beating a frantic tattoo against my ribs. Logic battled with fear, and for a moment, it seemed logic might actually lose. Shaking my head to clear it of these ridiculous fancies, I mustered what dignity I could and retreated. "Not tonight, Casper," I muttered under my breath, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent house. The sound ceased abruptly, as if the basement specter was offended by my lack of appreciation for its nocturnal serenades. Back in the relative safety of my bedroom, I tried to return to my writing, but the words blurred before my eyes. The scratching had resumed, this time accompanied by what sounded suspiciously like sighing. "Critics," I scoffed, trying to inject humor into the situation. However, my attempts at levity were cut short when a shadow flitted across the threshold of my door. I froze, every hair on my body standing at attention. Slowly, I turned, half expecting to face some demonic critter with too many eyes and a penchant for novelist's blood. But there was nothing, just the flickering shadows cast by the storm outside. Exhausted by fear and frustration, I finally collapsed into bed, the sheets cold and unwelcoming. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if it held the answers to this haunted puzzle. Sleep, when it came, was a grudging visitor, tiptoeing in and leaving me restless with dreams of whispering shadows and wailing basements. The sound of knocking jerked me awake. Heart pounding, I glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. Seriously? I groaned, throwing back the covers. The knocking persisted, urgent and unyielding. With a sigh, I shuffled toward the inevitable, muttering, "This had better be good, or at least award-winningly horrifying." As I approached the door, my mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps a pizza delivery gone horribly astray. Or maybe the local wildlife had developed a taste for dramatic entrances. I opened the door with a flourish, half expecting to find the ghost of Hamlet's father on the other side, ready to impart some tragic royal secrets. Instead, the porch was empty, save for the howling wind which seemed almost to laugh at my expense. "Very funny," I muttered to the unseen prankster. "You got me. Ha ha." The cold night air bit at my skin, a physical reminder of the joke I was currently living in. Closing the door, I turned back to my fortress of solitude, or insanity, depending on the horror of night. As I walked back to my bedroom, the floorboards creaked underfoot with the timbre of an old ship groaning through a storm. It was then I realized, this wasn't just a house, it was a ship, and I was its lone, reluctant sailor navigating through a sea of shadows and noises. Climbing into bed, I pulled the covers up to my chin like a shield against the night. Sleep, however, proved a fickle friend. Just as I began to drift off, a crash from the living room jolted me awake. Heart thudding against my rib cage, I lay frozen, listening. Had one of the windows surrendered to the relentless wind? Or had something decided to invite itself in? Gathering every shred of courage I could muster, which admittedly wasn't much, I tiptoed to the living room. The room was bathed in moonlight, filtering through the agitated branches of the trees outside, casting eerie patterns on the floor. That's when I saw it. A book had fallen from the shelf. Just a book. I laughed, a sound that was more a release of pent-up fear than amusement. "Of course it's just a book. This isn't a horror novel, you know," I told the empty room, hoping my words were more convincing than they felt. I was about to head back to bed when a soft thump from the direction of the basement made my steps falter. "Not now, not again," I pleaded silently, not in the mood for another round of "guess that terrifying noise." But as I stood there, the house quieted, as though holding its breath along with me. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When it did, the sunlight felt like a benediction, the fears of the night melting away in the warmth of the new day. I packed my bags, each item a testament to my survival in this gothic tale. As I zipped up my suitcase, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes upon me, watching, waiting. Arthur was waiting for me outside, his smile as enigmatic as ever. "Did you enjoy your stay?" he asked, a twinkle of mischief, or was it malice, in his eyes. "It was enlightening," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "I'll never look at basements, or rules, the same way again." As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The silhouette of the house stood against the sky, stoic and silent. I shuddered, not from the cold, but from the realization that some nights, some noises, would stay with me long after I left. And there, in the highest window of the house, a figure watched me leave. A farewell or a warning? The answer, like the house and its spectral inhabitants, remained shrouded in shadow and mystery. If you've enjoyed this chilling tale, think about your own brushes with the unexplained. Have you ever encountered something truly inexplicable? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you love spine-tingling tales like this one, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to get notified every time I post a new video. Stay tuned, stay scared, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones we live ourselves.